Thank you for joining today's webinar on the forgotten foundations of fundraising with a focus on capital campaigns. The webinar is a project of the Center for Civil Society and AmPhil. The Center for Civil Society strengthens America's voluntary associations by improving the effectiveness of donors, charitable foundations, and nonprofit organizations. The center fulfills its mission through education, providing research, publications, webinars like this, masterclasses, and in-person events. It's a project of AmPhil, and our belief is that if America's voluntary organizations can more fully realize their missions, American civil society and American democracy will become healthier, and American individuals and communities will more fully flourish. AmPhil is a leading provider of integrated professional services with a mission to strengthen civil society by helping mission-driven enterprises flourish. My name is Scott, and I'll be the host. At AmPhil, I serve as a managing consultant, working with nonprofit organizations throughout the United States. We have two great guests for this conversation about campaigns, Carrie Alice Robinson and Sandy Schrader. They are accomplished women and leaders with years of experience in life and mission advancement. Today, we'll focus on capital campaigns, but the breadth of experience and knowledge extends far beyond this topic. Let me briefly introduce them, and then we'll get into some questions. Sandy Schrader is a senior consultant with AmPhil's Capital Campaigns Group, and through her role, advises clients in pre-campaign planning, leadership engagement, and campaign strategy and execution. And her more than 20 years of advancement experience, primarily in the higher education sector, Sandy has helped numerous organizations increase capacity and mission impact and to pursue excellence. Before AmPhil, Sandy served as the executive director of advancement at Fuller Seminary in California, where she led a $150 million campaign to a successful completion. Sandy is a two-time graduate of Washington University in St. Louis, and she earned her MBA from Maryville University, also in St. Louis. Carrie Alice Robinson has worked with Leadership Roundtable since its inception, serving first as its founding executive director for 11 years, then as a global ambassador for 4 years, and currently as executive partner for global and national initiatives. Leadership Roundtable is dedicated to promoting best practices in management, finances, and human resources for the Catholic Church by harnessing the managerial expertise and financial acumen of senior level lay executives. Carrie serves or has served as a trustee on national and international boards, too many to name, and she has been an advisor to grant-making foundations, charitable nonprofits, and family philanthropies since 1990. Carrie is a frequent writer and speaker on the subjects of philanthropy, fundraising, and faith. And she's a prize-winning author of my favorite book on fundraising and that of many others, Imagining Abundance, Fundraising, Philanthropy, and a Spiritual Call to Service. Prior to her time at Leadership Roundtable, Carrie served as the Director of Development for St. Thomas More Catholic Chapel and the Center at Yale University, and she led a successful $75 million campaign to expand and to endow the chapel's intellectual and spiritual ministry and to construct a Catholic student center. Carrie received a BA degree from Georgetown University and a Master of Arts in Religion from Yale Divinity School. So we want to make this time, this webinar, helpful to you. We want, as the hour comes to an end, we will not go more than an hour. We want to make sure you feel like it was time well spent. So if you have any questions as we go along, please ask them. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, or you can use the chat function. So feel free to use either of those, and we'll be monitoring the Q&A and the chat functions for your questions. So please engage with Carrie, with Sandy, and myself, so we can make this a useful conversation to you. So I briefly, before we get into some questions to Carrie and to Sandy, I thought it might be helpful to just define the terms of what is a capital campaign? So for some, it's very obvious. To others, sometimes it's, from our experience, it's not quite clear. So briefly, a campaign is a fundraising effort aimed at raising a significant amount of money in a relatively short period of time. So for example, it might mean raising $500,000 in the next 6 months to a year, or it could be raising $10 million or $1 billion in 5 to 7 years. So it's a major fundraising effort to raise a lot of money in a relatively short period of time that is above and beyond your operation expenses. So it's not your annual fund. So, and also the money is typically raised for a specific program or building project or an endowment or a combination of all three. And a capital campaign does more than just sustain and advance an organization's mission. It has the power to really transform an organization. So I just wanted to kind of define a capital campaign before we move into questions. So Carrie, I had the pleasure of meeting with you and Father Bob Boulogne in New Haven at Yale University, because I wanted to, as a director of development of a Catholic center at the University of Penn, I wanted to learn from your experience at St. Thomas More, because I had read your book, Imagining Abundance, and also the preceding article in American Magazine. I just loved the way you presented fundraising and your experience at St. Thomas More through that book, though your book's about much more than just that experience at St. Thomas More. But I'd like to just start off the questions with, when you look back on your time at St. Thomas More, now it's in distance, what are the key lessons or principles that still shape how you go about any fundraising efforts that you're involved in today?
Well, first, Scott, let me say what an honor it was that you came to Yale's campus to meet with Father Bob Boulogne and me. When we entered this work together, particularly when we started the capital campaign, we did it not so much to give Yale University one more thing to be properly proud of, but really out of a sense of vocation to help raise the bar of Catholic campus ministry everywhere. So in a sense, you coming to us was a validation of that original vocational desire on our part. And I just want to thank you publicly for doing that. So when I look back to those years, those remarkable years, now so long ago, I began this work with Father Bob when I was pregnant with my second child. That was 25 years ago. She used to be a daily reminder of how long we were at the work together as she grew up. But this is what I would say. Generosity is humankind's birthright. I am convinced of this. Generosity is humankind's birthright. And we are all called to be both generous and to serve as catalysts to inspire generosity in others. And that was very much at the heart of our work together. Almost everything we did in the context of the capital campaign was done with a commitment to living out our faith in the world. It was very intentional. And that was a fortunate thing because really neither of us had been trained formally in fundraising. We broke so many rules initially, not out of arrogance, but really out of ignorance. But the one thing we always had going for us was a radical commitment to the vision of what we were trying to bring to fruition. And that vision and the urgency in our view of that mission, of that vision, was the driving force to put shape to all of the hard work of raising money. I really see this call around generosity only retrospectively as clearly as I do, but I believe I see it in vocational terms that we really truly are called to be generous. And the more generous we are, the more generative we are, and the more we serve as catalysts to inspire others' generosity, the greater the contribution we are collectively making.
Carrie, what kind of rules did you break?
I set myself up for that. That's for sure. Well, typically,
Yeah.
typically, for example, one would do a feasibility study to assess the landscape, and we didn't even know how to spell that word, let alone that it was in actual practice. This is how rudimentary our skills were when it came to fundraising. There's also the practical advice that you raise money during a silent phase, and you raise a significant percentage of your total goal. And that way, when you publicly announce the capital campaign, there is this momentum already at hand, because you can proudly let your constituents know how much has been raised toward that goal. We didn't know about that rule. I mean, really, it's astonishing to find myself a guest on your podcast, on your show here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But what we did do exceedingly well was learn how to tell our story and to tell it very well. And it drove everything that we did. We also applied a lot of our own shared faith and spiritual practices to the activity of raising money. And there's incredible consistency in my view. For example, we learned that not to see donor prospects or donors as objects to try to get as much money out of as quickly and painlessly as possible, but rather as subjects in their own right, who, like all of us, have hopes, dreams, fears, anxieties, aspirations, regrets, and yearnings. And once we were able to recognize that this was a sacred relationship that we were being invited into, to talk about things that are very intimate to a prospective donor, and to likewise be vulnerable ourselves in expressing what moves our hearts and what our greatest aspirations are for the project, then it became truly relational. And that always served us well. There was integrity to the purpose. There was integrity to the relationships.
What comes to my mind about the breaking of those rules, because Sandy, and I were and most fundraising consultants, practitioners would say, yeah, feasibility studies are important. A silent phase is to your advantage, but you have three things going for you. That when I frame the keys to a successful campaign, I frame it. You need a compelling case for support. You need leaders with the will to drive the campaign forward, and you need a sufficient number of stakeholders or donors, prospective donors with major gift capacity. You had all three of those. You use the word a radical commitment. You and Father Bob were radically committed to seeing this thing successful, right? You had, of course, a very compelling, case for leveling up campus ministry at Yale, programmatically as well as through, building projects. And you had the constituents. Yale has, tens of thousands of living alumni. So you had those things that allowed you to break those rules. And then you treat donors relationally, as subjects and non-objects, and you ask for money. You ask for money, and that's the number one reason people give, is because you ask them. So, yeah.
True, but I would say, especially if some of your listeners are approaching their own fundraising or their own capital campaign plans with some anxiety or trepidation, I would say that is completely normal. And in our case, not only did we not have this training or this recourse to best practices and consultation, we had discovered that our own board had permanently deleted 80% of our mailing list, because when we began the campaign, it was at a time of great fiscal distress that the center was experiencing. And this was a cost-saving measure because none of those alumni had contributed to the annual appeal. We were also in debt, which was rather shocking and extraordinary. We had a small endowment that had been conservatively invested over time. And the response to fiscal distress was to shrink the programming, to cut back on staff, and to borrow from this endowment to pay the operating costs. So it wasn't really an easy layup by any stretch of the imagination. And I would say as people are beginning their own deliberations about starting a capital campaign, I would say do a proper audit of all of the resources at your disposal. I mean, this is why a feasibility study makes sense, but be imaginative and creative in that audit. When we did an audit at the start of our campaign about finances, the picture was bleak. That's why I can rattle off these facts about debt and diminished mailing list. But when we expanded our imagination and asked the question, what really are the assets at our disposal? We realized that we had ignored probably the greatest asset at our disposal, and that was Yale Catholic faculty. And we began intentionally to include them in the ministry. We invited them to speak about their personal life of faith. It cost us only the cost of a spaghetti dinner after the 5 p.m. Sunday liturgy, but it was an incredible example of living out our mission and an example we could then tell alumni about so that they would be encouraged to invest in us for the next creative idea.
Sandy, since we've mentioned a feasibility study, or there are two questions. What are some questions that the organization should be asking when they're beginning to think about a campaign? So there's this idea like, oh, I wish we could do this, or I wish we could build that, or we need more financial security. Maybe we need an endowment. What are even before a feasibility study or a campaign planning study? What are some questions that they should be asking?
Carrie,
I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question too. Maybe even as in your role, engaging with organizations, in the United States or around the world. Some questions you might be looking for in a pre-campaign phase. So, Sandy, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you, Scott. And Carrie, so much of what you have said is so very valuable. So I'm going to really kind of spin off of many of the things that you have mentioned. As Carrie has said, that many times organizations they'll want to do a campaign, but they may not be aware of what it takes to get to that starting line for that campaign. And so much of the work that we do at AmFil, and much of my 20 plus years of experience in the fundraising space, has been that of really working with not only the organization itself, but the donors, and talking through what is the vision, the mission, and is there alignment between the organization's vision and mission and the passion points, the interests, the love that the donors or prospects have for that organization. And so much of what you talked about, Carrie, especially with the faculty, they were your starting point in many ways for the work of the campaign. You were able to tap into their love for the ministry, their love for the overall goals of the campaign that would come after that. So as we work with organizations, we begin with really 3 simple questions of, do you have a plan in place? And when I say that, it's everything from what is your vision, not only the organizational vision, but the vision for the campaign, and why are you doing this? Many times that's difficult. It may be that you need more space, and therefore you want to build a bigger building, or you need to expand. But that in and of itself is not necessarily missional. It's pressing into that you need more space so that you can serve more, so that you can expand your mission, so that you can reach more people, or whatever that is for your organization. And then even going a step beyond that and say, well, okay, if we are able to do that, if we are able to raise that additional money, build that building, do the expansion, whatever that is, what difference will it make? Will it truly make a difference in the lives of our clients, of our of those that we serve? And so really, what is that overall plan, that vision for your campaign? And then, do we have the right people? And that's everything from the leadership, the board, the donors or prospects. You talked about having this diminished mailing list. Who are those people that we'll be reaching out to? How do we get in touch with them? Where are they? How can we reach them? How can we get them excited about what we're doing? And do we have the staff that can support this? There's always the reality of, we only have so much time. And so are we able to do that with our current capabilities? And then the third question is, are we aligned on our priorities? So there's many organizations that will say, well, we need to do this. Oh, and then we need to do this and this and this. And if you sit down with 2 or 3 or 4 different people from the organization, whether they're board or leadership or staff, they may all have different ideas. And getting to a point that those ideas are distilled and we can craft a case for support and a reason that is understandable to those that are prospects and donors, to the outside audience, and really tell a story of, here's where we're at. And then as we look to this campaign, here's where we would like to go. And so that, for me, those are kind of those beginning questions. I'd love, Carrie, to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Sandy, I wish that we had known you as we were starting this campaign, because everything you have just said rings so true and is so practically helpful. I got to the point, we became so clear about the reason we were carrying out this capital campaign and sort of the vision that we were headed toward, that the building that we were building and the dollar amount that was the goal almost became distractions to what we perceived as our real purpose. So I just loved how you framed that, and the deliberative questions that you suggest people wrestle with before they embark on a capital campaign. Very, very true in my own experience.
So Sandy, you were kind of laying out some of these questions that an organization should be asking before beginning any formal feasibility study, if they're going to. So tell us about a feasibility study. What's entailed with a feasibility study. And Carrie, if you've had experience with other organizations who've actually conducted formal feasibility studies, would love to hear your thoughts on the pros and the cons and what value you may see in them. So
yeah. I like to think of a feasibility study as kind of that preparation. When you're having guests over to your home, you need to not only assess, okay, do we have enough chairs and seats at the table, and is the house clean and all of those things, but what are we cooking? What's going to be for dinner? What are the beverages? And so in many ways, thinking about it as we're getting ready for this and this campaign, this expansion. And so a feasibility study really helps to let your organization, your leadership, as well as your donors know that you have done the steps ahead of time to make sure that the campaign will be successful or as successful as possible. And so again, thinking of the inviting people over to your home, it's nice when neighbors and friends and family just stop by, but your expectation is very different if they're just stopping by or if they have been invited over for an event. And a campaign is an event, it is an opportunity to raise funds above and beyond those dollars that are already sustaining your organization. Scott, in the intro, you had said the annual fund, and it is the above and and beyond. Why do we need this these additional funds above and beyond that? So the feasibility is that opportunity to step back and to say, okay, where are we going? What do we want to do? What do we want to accomplish with this potential campaign? Do we have what we need? And that is, again, everything from the donors. Do we have donors that would actually give to this? As well as, do we have our internal operations, our staff? Do we have enough staff for that? As well as, do we have support and do we have excitement from the board and from the leadership? So it's assessing where are we at as an organization, and are we ready to embark on this potential campaign? And then it's beginning to distill all of that into what we call a case for support. And so putting that vision and saying, here's what we'd like to do. And then as we get that case for support written, then it is going to our top 25 or perhaps 75 stakeholders, those donors, those people in the community, those clients, our leadership, whoever it is for your organization that you would say, these are the most important people that we want to weigh in to this campaign before we actually launch the campaign. And so it's taking this case for support and saying to them, interviewing them and saying, one, what's your relationship with the organization? What do you think the strengths are? So asking, 10 or so questions about not only the organization itself, but about the vision, the case for support that has been created as a preliminary to really explain the potential campaign. And with that case for support and with these interviews, what we do is we get to test. I think of it very much as a testing. Here's the vision. Here's where we're going with this. And you, valued donor, that person that is critically important to the organization, do you agree with this? Does this make sense to you? Or what we have, has the way that we have articulated this, does this bring out, what does this evoke for you? And would you support it? And so what we get to do is not only assess the internal organization, as well as what would be the potential response of the external community. Would they support it? And would they support it at the level that we believe that they would, that we want them to, and believe that they could? So in many cases, as part of the feasibility study, we'll ask those that we're interviewing, if the campaign does go forward, what potentially would you be willing to give in support of this? And really kind of a gauging of a high and low.
And Sandy, just interrupt you, like actually asking people, like,
we're not at this point, we're not soliciting, but rather getting indications of potentially what would they be willing to give to a campaign, to this campaign if it goes forward. So as the feasibility study is complete, what has been assessed is, again, not only the internal organization, but also what could be raised. And does the vision of what you're raising money for, is that resonating with your constituents? And over what time period could that be done? So a feasibility study really helps to give the organization an overall roadmap in many cases for a successful campaign. And I think it really helps to set expectations appropriately to say, hey, we're ready to do this. We're ready to get this off of the ground. Or in some cases, a feasibility study gives you the information of, gosh, you wanted to raise $20 million, but what we're hearing from your donor base and from those that really love your organization, that may not be a doable goal this year or in the near future. So maybe you need to back up a bit. Let's get set up for success. Not to say that you can't do the campaign, but doing the campaign right now would either mean that your goal would need to be a whole lot less, or it may not be successful. And perhaps getting your house in order would be the most fruitful thing for your organization to do right now, and postpone beginning the campaign for another year or 2 years. So in many ways, it's not only an assessment, but also a testing the waters. Is this going to work? And at what level will it work? What is a reasonable goal for you as an organization to be able to raise?
Carrie, give us some perspective on feasibility studies from organizations that you've worked with, or that you've consulted with through the Leadership Roundtable.
So again, Sandy has said this so compellingly and articulately. I wonder what would have happened if we had had the advantage of beginning the capital campaign at St. Thomas More at Yale with a proper professional feasibility study. And I've been haunted by that question for 25 years. Because we didn't have one, our own board had to be persuaded for 3 years by Father Bob, once he arrived on campus, about the merits of even beginning to be serious about fundraising. After 3 years, he finally persuaded them, and they said, essentially waving a white handkerchief, okay, you can have your capital campaign. Father Bob, what's the goal? And he, again, without any real scientific data on this, literally blurts out $5 million. Collectively, the board gasps, $5 million. We thought you would say 1 million, and we don't believe that is possible. So our own board was very, very squeamish about this. That put a lot of the onus on us to be exceedingly confident and compelling and visionary and persuasive about why this mattered and why it mattered now. In a sense, the $5 million was an arbitrary amount, but it was a starting point at least. And things changed for us as well as we began to articulate our vision and cast a wide net to try to reclaim constituents who had been let go of deleted from the mailing list. Something rather miraculous happened, and that was that Yale University was persuaded to lease us property that they owned. So they were leasing the Catholic Center property that Yale owned for 99 years for one payment of $20. Now, just that alone is a massive, massive success. But it allowed us then to use that property to secure an architect and to build a center of consequence that would house the program that we had. That meant a radical increase of our campaign goal from 5 million to now it was a $25 million goal. So in the end, as you kindly said in your introduction, we raised $75 million. The elegant note is that our board was responsible collectively for 5 million of that 75 million. So the very amount that they thought was prohibitively impossible, they ended up contributing. So there's something really important and transformative about capital campaigns done faithfully and well. It attracts people. People want to belong to something that is of benefit to others, that is successful, that is big in vision and meets an unmet or undermet need.
Yeah, I think that's something worth emphasizing, that last part, Carrie, about that campaigns are, and I say this all the time, to organizations, that campaigns are not just about raising money. They're about is an opportunity, to introduce, the mission of that organization, to new audiences or to current audiences that you want to, bring deeper into the life of your organization. So
so many times campaigns can be transformative, and many times it's because they do have a transformative vision and people rally around that. But also for organizations that are in some ways floundering, and as you really tell the story, my sense is that there was, there's kind of there was this aspect of like, gosh, we're in debt. We've lost so many of our donors. Where do we go from here? And failure isn't fatal. So as you're haunted by the fact that you didn't do a feasibility study, that, yes, would that have helped? Oh, yes, absolutely. I have no doubt. But at the same time, what you did was a lot of hard work, a lot of sludging, blood, sweat, and tears, and a vision that was developed in many ways over time, that people were able to rally around. And so campaigns can, first and foremost, we look at campaigns as the opportunity again to to raise more money than really in most cases was ever thought possible, and in a succinct time period. But campaigns are also the opportunity to jumpstart getting a very good and solid development or advancement operation in place. It's getting donors back in many cases that have fallen away for many different reasons. And so campaigns can be used to do many, many different things, and can be very important, a very important tool to strengthen the overall organization and to get alignment. Many times a campaign is what, again, people rally around because, goodness gracious, this organization finally has a clear, crisp vision that I can now join in, and I can be a hero and help support and help make this happen. And campaigns allow organizations to do that.
Yeah. And I would argue that, an organization should not just do a campaign to raise money. They should set out for it to be transformational. Just don't do it. So I think that find a way to make it, but that you're going to cast a transformational vision. So, good. Anything else from your experience, Carrie? Through the Leadership Roundtable, and I'm not sure if you get much into. You're focused on more temporal affairs, management, finances, human resources, but any other advice or perspectives from Leadership Roundtable world?
So directly related to our work with Leadership Roundtable, which Leadership Roundtable came into existence as a response to the abuse crisis 20 years ago in the Catholic Church. But it was never explicitly about sexual abuse. That was not our forte. It was about the underlying conditions that may have contributed to the crisis. And it was an appeal to church leaders to recognize the hidden treasure in their midst, specifically the expertise of senior level lay executives, Catholics from every industry and sector who cared about the church, loved the church, and had something to contribute. When we started the capital campaign at St. Thomas More, it was absolutely essential, almost intuitively essential to us that everything we did on behalf of St. Thomas More, from how people were greeted when they walked into the chapel, to the quality of homiletics, to the quality of music, to how we treated staff, financial accountability and transparency, honoring donor intent, everything that could possibly impact the mission and the experience of St. Thomas More at Yale mattered and had to be done at the highest levels of care and excellence, because we want it to be worthy of generosity, profound generosity. And you can't cut corners with important missions. So it all matters. We have a tendency, I think, in the nonprofit sector, certainly in the faith-based nonprofit sector, to think of there are the business or the temporal side of life, HR practices, financial accountability, facilities, et cetera. And there is the spiritual or the faith, the nonprofit mission that is aimed at the alleviation of human suffering or inspiring faith or hope. And we separate those unconsciously, I think, and we prioritize one over the other. And in so doing, we have this tendency to think of things of the world, the temporal side, as impure or less relevant. And that is to our detriment, absolutely to our detriment, because to be worthy of generosity, to be trustworthy, is to be accountable, is to aspire to excellence, even if excellence can't be attained. It's the commitment to it for the sake of one's mission.
Yeah, someone listening on the webinar commented on that phrase you just used, Carrie, being worthy of generosity. So they thought that was an awesome line, and it's one that I because of your book, Carrie, I carry with me, just that encouraging organizations to be worthy of generosity. I think it might even be my bio on the AMFIL website. I'm serious. Just helping organizations be worthy of philanthropic support. So, and that means in finances, and in how people present themselves and 1,000 other things. So good. A question from someone on the webinar: how does one balance normal operational functions, just getting stuff done in the organization, with such a big project such as a capital campaign? Anything?
Yeah, that's really a tension point for organizations. And again, a feasibility study in the pre-planning to a campaign can really help to identify, are there voids in staff that need to be addressed before embarking on a campaign? Or if, okay, everyone is at full capacity right now, pre-campaign, then, what does that mean as you move into campaign mode? And so that tension needs to be addressed, and hopefully it is addressed before the campaign begins. In general, the campaign, obviously, I like to think of it as a quarterback. There's a campaign manager, a campaign management firm that will be guiding and leading the execution of that campaign. Ideally, that works really, really well. But at the same time, it can't just be there's the campaign over here on the right, but then we have our normal operations over here on the left, and the two don't ever talk. It's absolutely critical to integrate the campaign into the messaging, the overall goals and work of the organization itself, so that it doesn't end up being a bifurcated effort. And I've actually seen some organizations that there's a competition of, do these funds go to the campaign or do they go to our operations? And when you hear those conversations, you begin to say, gosh, let's find a way to integrate that together. Because if you're saying that internally as an organization, that very subtle message is going out to your donors. So you have to be very conscious and intentional before embarking on a campaign, that you have identified who will be leading that campaign, who will be, if it is a outside campaign consulting firm or a additional role that you've put on staff, who's going to be your liaison, who will be communicating with the board, how will it fold into and integrate with the overall development operations, the marketing, the communication, again, making it seamless, because we certainly don't want the mission, the clients, those that we're serving, we don't want them to be negatively affected by the fact that you're having a campaign. We actually want them to be blessed in the midst of the campaign.
Yeah, two thoughts on that. About this idea of being worthy of generosity, just like before you even consider a campaign or enter into a planning phase, make sure you're operationally excellent, right? You have your database figured out, you have your programs properly staffed and organized, and you have the right people on staff, and there's organizational health. So you're worthy of support.
Right.
And so that when you enter into an intense campaign and stresses are placed on that organization, it's going to be, you're going to be able to sustain the normal operations. So, and then on this topic as well, I'm a big believer in having a campaign be something that everyone on the staff is involved in some way, that they feel, whether they're on the program staff and they're not in development, that even the program staff feel like my organization is doing a campaign and I have a role to play. So there's that famous story of when John F. Kennedy was touring NASA and asked the janitor, what are you doing? And being polite, and said, I'm putting a man on the moon, but he was just cleaning the bathroom. So that, the idea of having a rallying cry for everyone in the organization that we're going to be accomplishing this capital campaign to advance the mission, transform our organization. It's not just a development staff thing. So.
Right.
How did Father Bob get everything done, in his pastoral duties, and going here, there, and everywhere, and being on phone calls, and any thoughts or memories from that?
Yeah, it was a big commitment, obviously. He was full-time as Catholic chaplain at Yale. And in fact, the more transformative our work together was, the greater numbers of students were participating in the life of the Catholic Center. And the faculty were coming and they were bringing their families. So the demands on his time increased with every success that we had in carrying out this vision, which is a happy problem to have. But practically speaking, we had a strategy, which is at the beginning of every semester, he and I would sit down together and we would block off days on the calendar that were sacrosanct for development, and specifically for development travel. This was the first time in Yale's Catholic's history that the chaplain left campus to visit alumni in their offices and in their homes. And part of my role was to take those days that we had agreed to reserve for travel and choose a city where there were considerable numbers of Catholic alumni and call down the list. Now, it was often cold calling them, and we had to sort of piece back together our database. So I wasn't always calling Catholics. That was a whole other story. But in any case, I would have about 30 seconds on the phone to persuade the prospective donor that it was worth their time to meet with Father Bob and me when we were in Los Angeles. And that became such a critical aspect of what we did, that 30 seconds of being confident and joyful and persuasive, harder to get someone's time than to get their money, to be honest.
Yeah.
And then we would travel and we would meet back to back and tell our story and engage the alumni in the life of the mission. And that's how we did it. And really it was the best use of our time, spending focused, intimate, visionary time with prospective donors.
That's good. Yeah, that's a great takeaway, for this webinar is, whether you're doing a capital campaign, or you're just doing regular fundraising to support your operations, carve out time in your calendar. If you're an executive leader, that's critically important, and get somebody to hold you accountable to doing that. So it's carve out the time to meet with donors, call donors. It's essential. Here's another question from somebody on the webinar. As someone who is just beginning to lay out a business plan for a new nonprofit, I'm also new to this nonprofit sector. What are some ways we should think about fundraising and capital campaigns as a brand new organization where you haven't really been able to prove your excellence?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So just basically a brand new organization putting together a business plan. How does fundraising play into it? How does the demonstration of excellence play into it?
Yeah. For a brand new organizations, one of the biggest thing that comes to mind for me is really a strong, compelling vision. And as Carrie was talking about the visits, the personal visits that they would make, you said in there that you had this strong message for 30 seconds, and I think for a new organization or an organization just coming on board, if you have 30 seconds, how do you explain and share the passion that you have for your organization? How do you explain that to a person that you're standing in an elevator with, or that you've just met on the street? And so having that strong vision, and then as you begin, the organization begins its work and grows momentum from there. It really is communicating that outwardly, again, in small little sound bites. Here's the work that we're doing. Here's why it's important. Here's how you can come on board and help us and join us in this endeavor, in this critical endeavor. And here's why we're doing it. And in many cases, and if it doesn't, if we don't do it, if we're not able to do it, or if we don't have the funds to do that, then here's the downside. Those hungry people will continue to be hungry.
What I heard, Sandy, there is put in your business plan an elevator speech.
Absolutely. And that
Right
tugs on the heartstrings, that invites people in. So, again, that effective messaging we're all in the world of sound bites and microwaves and immediate everything. So we don't have big attention spans. So it has to be short and succinct.
Good. Let me see if there are any other questions here in the chat. Good. How about just to bring it up, we're going to end, no later than 4 o'clock Eastern time. I know everybody's on different time zones, but we're going to end just in a few minutes. But any how would you, in a succinct way, Sandy, Carrie, how would you frame, the keys to conducting a successful campaign or fundraising in general? So just how would you summarize that, like kind of a framework for, an organizational leader, thinking about fundraising or specifically a capital campaign?
Why don't I start? And because I feel like Sandy has such practical, experiential advice, I will just say briefly, the two things we held firmly in mind. It can be done and it can be fun. The centrality of joy, the discipline of celebration, all of that really, really mattered. Nobody wants to contribute to a dour supplicant. So, and this is where I get back to the relevance of spiritual disciplines. It is a spiritual discipline to cultivate an inner life of joy. It's not facile joy. It's joy even in the midst of sorrow. It's joy even in the midst of incredibly demanding hard work. But that sense of joy and purpose and conviction that this mission mattered, and it mattered, frankly, to children we would never meet, who had not yet been born, who still have not yet been born. So it can be done and it can be fun. That's some good advice to hold in mind.
Yeah, absolutely, Carrie. You're right on with that. I agree wholeheartedly. I think as I think about that question, where I would go is so much of fundraising, so much of campaigns is that aspect of relationships. And as human beings, we are relational. We do want to come together. We do want a purpose for our lives. And as we've talked about before, that generosity component is absolutely critical for our lives to be full of joy. And so a campaign allows people to invest in not only of their time, but also their treasures into organizations that are helping to, we may not be able to fix our broken world, but gosh, we can do a lot of good work while we're here. And so it gives people a purpose. It allows them to be heroes and enter into this space of brokenness and make a difference. And so our job is to invite people into that and give them relationship, purpose, joy, and allow them to be the heroes in the midst of some sometimes terrible stuff and sometimes awful pain that's happening in our world.
Good. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Sandy.
Beautiful, Sandy.
Thank you.
So we'll bring this webinar to a close. Thank you very much for joining it. And just two brief events that I wanted to promote on behalf of the Center for Civil Society. First, we have AmPhil's comprehensive seminar on major gifts fundraising to take place in Denver on July 10th, 11th, and 12th. This training will be designed for nonprofit leaders looking to learn and brush up on major gifts fundraising. We talked about some of that today, and see the link in the chat or on AmPhil's event page. And then second, if you're hungry for another webinar, check out this Thursday's webinar on Thursday, June 29th with Luke Shahan, who is a professor at Duquesne University and author of the critically acclaimed Why Associations Matter. And he's a premier scholar on how federal courts have given the essential right to assembly legal short shrift. He'll be joined by the Center for Civil Society's senior fellow, Jack Fowler, for an hour-long discussion. You can learn more about that on the events page on AmPhil's website. So with that, we'll bring it to a close. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Sandy. And have a good rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both.